We're going to say hello again to Karen Salt. Thank you, Karen, for agreeing to chair this final panel. For those of you who weren't here this morning, I'm not going to go into Karen's full bio, it is online, but Karen is from the University of Aberdeen. She is not just a scholar, but she is an activist as well, so perfect combination. And Karen will introduce her panel to you.
Thank you, everyone. If we could just kind of reconnect for a minute. Those who might need to journey out, please go ahead and do so. But just recenter yourself. It's a long day, so I understand that it's kind of hard to swing gears from thing to thing. Process as you need, journal, write, think about it, reflect. Take all the time that you need. And I am going to take the chair's prerogative to just inform or at least respond back to the young woman who asked a question about language. And I would actually say that part of our jobs, all of us, is to be accessible to each other. And it's not about depending upon any scholarly language or any sort of theoretical idea. It's actually trying to figure out a way to communicate to other beings and other entities in a way that is grounded in some reality, but also simultaneously means something and doesn't just make ourselves feel better because we've uttered something into the air. So I'm actually quite excited to see so many faces here from so many different backgrounds and areas, and I hope that you continue this conversation in an accessible manner with all sorts of people in your own lives and in your own careers or your paths or whatever those might be. So back to task. Right. This particular panel is Grassroots Activism and Black Lives Matter as a civil rights movement. So it'd be really interesting to counterpoint that with our radical push from the panel before. I will not go through all the biographies again because those biographies are already online. And you can look up all of those, all of our panelists. I would, though, invite everyone to tweet if you are tweeting. I would invite others to write your questions down if you have a question, something that you could both pose at the microphones that will be up later on, or approach the panelists, approach a speaker later on. Come up and actually have a conversation with them, as opposed to necessarily uttering, this setting doesn't necessarily lend itself to a conversation sometimes at the end. And if you're a person who would like to reflect a bit, just grab a person later on and actually have a conversation and talk. We'll start with Brian Kwoba. Did I do better? Where are you, Brian? Oh, Brian's in the restroom. Okay. I will fill the space. We will move on then, I think. We'll make sure Brian knows we will come back to him. But we'll actually, Adam, I hope you're ready. Yeah? I'm on the ball for this is true. And we'll go ahead with Adam Elliott-Cooper. His talk is Disruption at the Point of Consumption, How Black Lives Matter Changed What Solidarity Looks Like. Brian's here now. They're confusing me. It's a lot of change. You ready to go? All right. Sorry. No. You can't apologize for taking a moment out. It's all right. All right. So we're staying to task. Stay with me now. It's just me that's confused at this point. Brian Kwoba, and his is Lessons from History, Black Lives Matter, and the 2016 election. That is somewhere. Will tell us where in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just make sure I can drive this thing.
There's a controller
oh, there's a controller. Cool. So I'm talking about lessons from history, the movement for Black Lives, and the 2016 elections in the US. There's a difference between the Black Lives Matter organization and the movement for Black Lives, just to kind of make that distinction. But I wanted to begin by, well, let me just jump into it. I got a lot to say, so I'm gonna try to speak slowly, but if I'm going too fast, just like make some kind of signal, and I'll slow down. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about context. I think most of us are familiar with context, and a lot has been spoken about already. I'm going to move into some lessons from the 60s, and then I'm going to talk about Black Lives Matter and the 2016 elections. I recognize that this is a somewhat fraught subject, given how people, line up politically. But context, we all know about, the prison industrial complex. That's obviously a major issue in the US. There's wealth gap issues, particularly the gendered wealth gap, which is like extreme, $41,000 average or median wealth of a single white woman compared to $100 for a single black woman. And then, of course, the issue of police terrorism. Every 28 hours, a black person is killed. This is a statistic that has become more, I think, realized since the Black Lives Matter movement came forward, and is obviously something that's very much driving all the protests and things of that nature. One example is North Miami Beach police, who actually use black people as targets in their target practice. But as was pointed out just a second ago, I hear this a lot, this notion that race is an American problem. And I think that a lot of the, just to second what was said, a lot of the US iconography is in the UK. If you go to a secondary school in the UK, they learn about the civil rights movement in the US. And I think it's precisely to avoid discussing blackness in Britain, they focus on the UK. That's just what I've seen. So, we should be clear about, race is very much an issue in the UK. So, black infant mortality is twice that of white British babies. Whites are almost twice as likely to get a job as blacks when applying with the same qualifications in the UK. Black people in the UK are 2 to 3% of the population, but 15% of the prison population, which is actually, by some measures, a larger disproportion than in the US. So, these are the kinds of things that I think people in the UK need to become more familiar with, just to get some clarity about this. Of course, people know about stop and search, black people being stopped many times the rate of white people. When you compare, by ethnicity stop and search rates, again, I think these are familiar things. Mark Duggan, the uprisings across the UK that were triggered. If this wasn't the signal of a race problem, I'm not sure what was. So then, of course, there's the international dimensions, and I'm glad that Josh spoke about this. That is the fact that Britain, has imperialist foreign policy for a long time and is investing in conflict in different parts of the world. Africa being one example of where there's a lot of Western oil and arms interests. The U.S. has a cancerous military presence on the continent, as do the French and others. The drone strikes is a good example of U.S.-UK collaboration, because some of the drone strikes are flown out of RAF bases at Croughton and Waddington into Eastern Africa and Yemen and so on and so forth. Then there's the destruction of Libya. I mean, this is a massive attack on not only an African country, but a country that was deeply committed to the Pan-African project in many ways, with funding the AU and so on and so forth. So just to put that out there, I think the point is that these things we're talking about, specifically anti-blackness, racism, white supremacy, are the product of a longer history, right, of slavery, colonization, imperialism, and so on and so forth. We know about the transatlantic slave trade, and there's also an Arab slave trade, obviously, in Eastern Africa, the Middle Passage, so-called, all of the atrocities and torture and rape that went into that. There's the whole colonial period of the history. There's lynching in the United States. So again, this is all context that I think is really important, because it's informed the way in which anti-blackness is a global phenomenon. This is something that, I think is an important thing to understand, because it speaks to, if this is a global problem, then we need a global solution, right? And I think the movement for Black Lives, one of the ways it can stay relevant in the coming election year of 2016, which, if you know anything about US elections, politics usually takes a step back because everybody's focusing on getting out the vote. And so I think one of the ways that we can avoid the danger of becoming irrelevant is linking up with forces outside of the US, Pan-African, Black movements. Palestine solidarity is one example of how this has been happening, which I think is promising, although also fraught with some dangers vis-a-vis anti-Blackness in the Arab world. But also Marikana and South Africa is a really important place to watch. The Economic Freedom Fighters are this massive opposition party, openly socialist party. They got over 1 million votes in the last elections last year, and of course are part of a process including now the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall movements in South Africa. I think that's a key place for Black Lives Matter to link up and build solidarity amongst Black people as a global people. So to get into the history, how did we make Black Lives Matter historically? I mean, there's a rich tradition, which I won't have time to really go into detail of, but we have to build on the past. We all have parents, we all have ancestors, and I just want to sort of speak to the fact that Pan-Africanism, for example, doesn't begin in the mind of some intellectual. It begins right here, right? This is a Pan-African uprising in the sense that Africans from different groups who resisted on the ships or who resisted on the plantations were Pan-Africanists in the sense that they had to unite in order to advance the project of liberation. Of course, there's the more sort of well-known figures in the US context, people like Booker T. Washington, who was kind of a Black capitalist type figure and a colonialist. He worked with German colonialism in Togo. So not somebody who I suggest we look to, but someone to recognize at least. Du Bois, who sort of had a different approach, supporting public protest and political action. There's Ida B. Wells, who was a very famous national campaigner against lynching. Somebody who I do research on is Hubert Harrison, who was kind of the father, quote unquote, of Harlem radicalism and did a lot of pioneering work for what was called the New Negro movement in Harlem, with the politics of Africa first and working with people like Ida B. Wells to oppose lynching and things of that nature. So this is just some of the more recent 20th century history. Obviously, there's Marcus Garvey, which people have mentioned. To bring it up a little bit more contemporarily, obviously we have the whole sort of civil rights history, the bus boycotts, the sit-ins. Ella Baker is someone who really helped with SNCC in terms of organizing the student wing of the movement and supporting a real grassroots leadership. And this is one of the reasons why she's not better known, is she was kind of behind the scenes and doing a more kind of grassroots kind of approach to Black leadership. There's the freedom rides, obviously, desegregating the buses, the March on Washington. I want to mention that this was organized largely by Bayard Rustin. Has anybody, raise your hand if you've heard of Bayard Rustin? Okay, a few people. This was an openly gay, same gender loving Black civil rights activist who organized the March on Washington. And part of why he's not better known is precisely because of the homophobia and the sort of exclusionary politics that were prominent at that time, and still in some ways we deal with today. But just to point out, this was mostly a project of his. Voting rights struggles, there was repression, obviously, cops were sent in just like they are now. Civil Rights Act was signed, and there's an interesting quote that comes in 1965, down here at the bottom. The changes that came about during this period were at best surface changes. They were not really substantive changes. Now, you might read a quote like that and think, oh, that must be like Malcolm X or somebody really radical. Actually, that was Dr. King. Dr. King himself came to this conclusion after all of that. And what people don't realize about King, particularly the King that you might learn about in the UK, is that he became a radical. So he got arrested 30 times protesting injustice. He called for a multiracial poor people's campaign for an economic Bill of Rights. He opposed the Vietnam War and US militarism. He was assassinated after calling for a general work stoppage during the context of the Memphis sanitation workers strike, while Memphis was under martial law. The National Guard was in, you couldn't protest. He said, we're marching anyway. So this is important history, I think, that we need to be cognizant of. I want to talk a little bit about this story of the Freedom Summer, because I think the Democratic Party played a very duplicitous role in this period. A lot of folks give credit to the Democrats and the white liberals, but this story tells a different story. Oh, 3 minutes, okay. Basically, they registered all these voters in Mississippi because the official Mississippi Democratic Party was segregationist and wouldn't allow them in. So students organized all these new voters. They tried to send a delegation to the Democratic National Convention, and they were offered 2 seats without voting power, which they rejected as a back-of-the-bus compromise. And it totally helped to radicalize the movement. As Malcolm X put it, you put the Democrats first, but they put you last. So this gets to the point that people like Gazi Kodzo are making now, that Black lives won't matter until Black power matters. So that gets us into the tradition of, Robert Williams, the Deacons for Defense, the Black Panther Party for self-defense that was mentioned. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There's some white liberals I was going to talk about who, managed COINTELPRO repression, oversaw the execution of Malcolm X, butchered the Vietnamese, et cetera, presided over the execution of Dr. King. Because I think it's important that that side of these people, yes, they did advance some legislative things, but they also were vicious in their repressive capabilities and actions. Change from the Democrats from within. It's been tried many times, and it hasn't worked. I could get into more stories about this, but I want to come to the contemporary. This is a really important idea that the Democratic Party is actually a graveyard of social movements. It's a place. It's a force that co-opts the leaders of social movements, gives them political positions so as to execute the movements that they belonged to. And I think there's a grave waiting for Black Lives Matter, unfortunately, in the coming election year. So just to get us, and this is a picture that shows that visually. So here's Hillary Clinton sitting with some, movement for Black Lives people, which I think is really a dangerous situation because this is what co-optation looks like, right? I'm not going to talk about I'm not going to talk about Trump. I'm not going to talk about Uncle Ben. I'm not going to talk about the third Bush because the Republicans are really not. It's really the Democrats, again, that are where Black people have, at least for the recent decades, been supporting and who we need to be most careful of, I think. So there's Hillary Clinton, would be the first woman president, has an image of a fighter for women and children, an insider who brings experience. But what kind of experience is she bringing? So we could get into, I don't have a lot of time, but she was basically, and her husband, Bill Clinton, were deeply complicit in the expansion of the prison industrial complex. So the 1994 Crime Control Act, which vastly expanded the prison system, the Anti-Terrorism and Death Penalty Act, which expanded the use of the death penalty, racist death penalty, doubling of the US prison population during the 90s. And various other things, which I don't have time to get into. But this is the point. It's like she's saying Black Lives Matter while raising funds from private prison lobbyists. Never mind all the other, sort of issues that she's a very right-wing Democrat, actually, someone who's very, very dangerous. And on foreign policy, she's a war hawk. I mean, she supports all the most right-wing imperialist interventions. About Gaddafi, she said, we came, we saw, he died. She thought it was smart power at its best, the destruction of Libya. So this brings me to the end, feel the burn. A lot of people looking to Bernie Sanders, in terms of someone who they like more than Clinton. And, there's some good things that he says about denouncing inequality, about getting money out of politics, and so on and so forth. And Black Lives Matter actually has pushed him to a more sort of racially sensitive position. He now has a racial justice platform. But, there's this thing where we've been hearing a lot, like, hey, he marched with Dr. King. He marched with Dr. King. Why don't you support Bernie? Like, why are Black Lives Matter activists? And there was this hilarious, hashtag on Black Twitter that I just had to share. Bernie so black. Folks seen that? Like, Bernie so black. He's the first one killed in horror movies, Bernie so black, he taught black power to Stokely Carmichael. He never forgot about Dre. My favorite one is this. Bernie so black, he actually handed Malcolm X this AK-47. Bernie said, "Let the chopper sing, Malcolm." So yeah, Bernie is, what's wrong with Bernie is, one thing is foreign policy. He supports all the US interventions you can name. So he's an imperialist in waiting. But also he's running as a Democrat, which means that he is going to, all the energy that he whips up and all this excitement is ultimately going to be funneled into Hillary's campaign. And so that's where a meme like this comes in, about sheepdogging the American left and getting Hillary elected. I think it's a duplicitous strategy that, again, has been tried before in history, and we have to be cognizant of that. So my last comment is just in terms of staying relevant in 2016, is that I think the movement for Black Lives has to stay independent of this corporate duopoly, this two-party system, which locks the political change. And I think, things like supporting other parties, things like continuing to protest and push for change rather than just getting out the vote, building a new party, and hopefully with, a sort of class consciousness, which I would add as a corrective to the Black as a nation concept, because we have Black nations on the continent. But they serve an elite, right? They serve a Black ruling class. And so, yeah, final word I'll just leave to that idea that we need to stay independent and make sure we're not just getting co-opted or corrupted by some of these Democratic Party and other kinds of forces. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you very much for that.
I'll add one little group onto that. If any of you know about the super base of the United States, is where the Chagosians are, which is the British Indian Ocean Territory. We can talk about that later on, about why did Parliament create the largest military protection zone at the same time the Chagosians won their ruling to return back to their island and kick off the US. So they're leasing it. The US are leasing it from the UK. Interesting times. Now, Adam, please. Adam Elliott-Cooper, who will be doing Disruption at the Point of Consumption, How Black Lives Matter, Change with Solidarity Looks like. Come on up.
I guess I'm going to be trying to answer two questions, which are two questions I try to think about a lot when I'm writing my PhD. And they're two quite simple questions, quite short questions with quite complex and long answers or possible answers. The first one is, how are people mobilised? How do we mobilise people? And the second is, how do we make that mobilisation effective? And I guess, I'm really happy that we're having this conference in Nottingham. I did my undergraduate degree at the university here, and I got my first youth work job here in a place called Radford, a very special place in this country, not far from here as well. And when I worked with a lot of the young people there, I was always interested in how I could engage the young people, predominantly black young people, in social issues, in thinking critically about the world around them. And so, I might try to talk to them about issues relating to race. And they'd be like, oh, come off all that black stuff, man. I don't want to hear all that black stuff. Why are you always talking about that black stuff? I'll be like, okay, fine. And I might try to talk to them about, capitalism and, class, right? And I'll come off all that, man. Like, I'm going to be rich one day. People are just poor because they're lazy. The usual kind of things, Thatcherism that has become very dominant. But as soon as I start to talk about the police, something changes. Yeah, bun the police, or words to that effect. And it was a really useful kind of avenue, a really useful conduit to having questions. Okay, so let's talk about the police. So the role of the police is to do what? To protect property, right? So whose property are they protecting? Are they protecting your property? No. Well, whose property are they protecting? And then you can begin to get into questions about class. And, of course, you can get into questions about race as well when it comes to policing. And a lot of the youth workers there, the older people who worked at the youth centre, were really, really interested and engaged and able to contribute a lot to these kinds of conversations. Because when I spoke to them about it, they were like, this was Hyston Green Youth Centre, and they said to me that in the 70s, there was a police station not far from this youth centre. And in 1981, they brought in the sus laws. So we firebombed it, and they never rebuilt it. And so there's a really rich history of black resistance here in Nottingham, which I think is really important for us to remember and really important for us to build upon when we think about not only how to mobilise people, how to relate to people's realities, but also so we don't keep trying to reinvent the wheel all the time. So one of the big kind of mobilisations, as we know, relating to resistance to police violence was when we saw all of these uprisings in the United States, particularly, I think, Ferguson, but even more so following Baltimore and the killing of Eric Garner and all the uprisings in parts in New York and elsewhere as well. And there were two kind of big solidarity protests here in the UK, well, the two in London that I attended. The first one was outside the US Embassy, and it was in solidarity with Ferguson. And it was called Flood the Embassy. And I thought, wow, okay, flood the embassy. This is what they're going to call the demonstration. Well, obviously, you're not going to flood the US Embassy, you'll die. But I guess it's a nice kind of rallying call for people. So I was like, cool. Went down to this protest. It seemed to be organised in a little bit of an ad hoc way. But what I was really pleased about was that there were families of British people who had died at the hands of the police. They had representatives from the Mark Duggan campaign and the Sean Rigg campaign. And they were able to talk about their campaigns for justice to an audience which perhaps they hadn't been able to access before, because people had seen what's happening in Ferguson on the news, because, as we know, both the television news and the liberal outlets like The Guardian feel far more comfortable talking about how awful racism is over in the US and are slightly less interested in what's taking place on our doorstep. And so people who had seen what's happening in the US were angry about it, had come down to the US embassy, but what they got when they arrived there were stories about injustices taking place not far from where they lived. And I thought that was something that was really important. We were going to where people were at, what people were aware of, and trying to bring them into what was taking place within our communities. And then what happened after that kind of quite static protest at the US embassy was a march, a bit of an impromptu march. This was mid-November, if I remember correctly, and the march left the US Embassy, which is just off Bond Street, a very busy shopping district. And as you can imagine, there's Christmas lights everywhere. They've probably been up since late August. And people, really, really packed streets, people doing their shopping. And hundreds, I think it must have been about 300 people, 200 people, marched through Bond Street, through Oxford Circus, blocking all of the major roads through here, and really basically shutting down one of the biggest shopping districts in central London. Really, really powerful. And I thought, this is really great. This is a real disruption to the kind of the everyday flowings, workings of the capital, and it's really kind of making the point clear. And then there was another protest organised, and this one was following the protest that we saw in places like Macy's and other big shopping districts in the United States. I don't know if people are aware, but the Black Friday sales were boycotted by many of the Black Lives Matter activists. And there was a kind of copycat solidarity protest in Westfield Shopping Centre. And we realised that the people organising these protests, perhaps, although they were really enthusiastic and they could mobilise a lot of people, there were certain health and safety things that that were kind of lacking. So myself and other people from an organisation called London Campaign Against Police and State Violence decided to be legal observers for this protest. We realised it was likely to be very disruptive. We know the police are likely to be perhaps more numerous this time round, and so we thought, okay, we need to have legal observers because people's safety is being put at risk. If people get arrested, they need to know what to do. Et cetera, et cetera. And that was a really interesting protest as well. So what it began with was a die-in inside Westfield, where probably about 200 protesters had a die-in. People who arrived late, I think the die-in probably began around 5:30 in the evening. People who arrived late, around 7 o'clock, had a separate protest outside in the streets, blocking loads of the major roads in Westfield Shopping Centre. Westfield Shopping Centre in Shepherd's Bush is the biggest shopping centre in London and the second biggest in the United Kingdom. So as you can, and this was in late November, so as you can imagine, this is a very, very, very busy shopping day for Westfield. And again, we saw what really pleased me was that we saw representatives from family campaigns in the United Kingdom speaking out about not only what's happening to Eric Garner, but also what's been happening to people here in Britain. One activist called Minka talks about, okay, you guys have all heard of Eric Garner, but very few of you have heard of Joy Gardner. And so made these kind of comparisons and said, look, you know about all these things happening across the Atlantic. These things are happening on our doorstep. And I think there was probably almost 500 people at that protest. So a lot of people who are really angry about police violence, really angry about racial violence because of what they'd seen on the news, were being introduced to something happening on their doorstep, a lot of them for the first time, which I thought was really, really important as well. And so this protest, eventually, the people who were inside Westfield eventually kind of came outside to join the other protesters. And so there was a huge protest throughout the streets in Westfield. And it was decided, the protesters among themselves decided that they wanted to go back into Westfield and occupy it again. And so hundreds of protesters burst into Westfield and shut down the whole of the shopping centre. Right? And this was I thought this was really, really significant. Right? So massive shopping day, lots of money being made on these kinds of shopping evenings in London's biggest shopping centre. They're not making a penny tonight. They're being shut down. And what eventually happened was that although the police were relatively hands-off, there were a few scuffles here and there, but the protesters although a lot of them were very, very young, for a lot of them it was their first protest. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged. People were respectful. It was peaceful disobedience. It was really, really smooth. After that, people left Westfield, and a group of maybe around, there must have been around 100 people or so, began to move from Westfield to a major motorway, which is by a big roundabout right near Westfield Shopping Centre. And as they began to run into the road, police just started grabbing people. And eventually I realised that I was in a kettle, which is when the police encircle a group of demonstrators and hold them there for a number of hours, generally before arresting them. I didn't think I would be arrested because I was a legal observer. I was clearly marked. I had a big orange luminous vest on. It said legal observer on the back. I had a notebook. I was liaising with all the police officers beforehand, taking all of their badge numbers, the kind of thing you have to do if you're a legal observer. That didn't make any difference. I was still arrested for violent disorder. And as were 75 other people who were attending the protest as well. And despite the arrests and a lot of young people being put off their first ever protests, which I think was probably the intention of the police, I feel like it was still an effective form of political action. And kind of debriefing with people afterwards, there were a lot of questions that were asked, particularly with older activists, I guess, because this kind of political action was something I think relatively new. And people asked quite sensible questions. And I guess the main question was, if you're protesting against police brutality, why are you shutting down a shopping centre? What's that got to do with, like, you should be protesting outside a police station or Parliament or the US Embassy? Like, why? It doesn't really make sense. And it's a pretty fair question, I think. So I began to think about this. Why Westfield? Why these big commercial shopping districts? And I think there are 3 to 4 kind of reasons that I kind of came up with. The first one's pretty straightforward. This is where people are at. People could see on the news that Macy's and other shopping districts in the US were being shut down. They saw something similar happening in the UK. They thought, wow, this is good what's happening in the US. This is happening in Britain. I'm going to get involved. It's a copycat action. I think the second reason that it was quite popular is that it was a kind of familiar space for young people. Young people hang out in shopping centres. That's what young people do. I almost said we. That's what young people do, right? And I guess the US Embassy and Parliament and various places aren't really comfortable places for young people to hang out. It's November, it's cold. Like being inside a shopping centre is much more comfortable and familiar. So I think that's another reason why it mobilised so many people. And I think the third reason is that it was quite a different form of protest action. It was quite creative. Shutting down a shopping centre, it was quite different to the kind of usual A to B protest march that people are accustomed to. But then I started to think historically about political action. I was fortunate enough to be volunteering at the monitoring group at this time, and I was talking to a lot of the people who worked there about the kind of political actions that had taken place in the past. And I was thinking a lot about the relationship between, what took place in the past and what's taking place today. And as well as, protests outside courts and police stations, government buildings and what have you, there's also another form of political action which used to take place a lot in the past, which doesn't so much anymore. And that's the strike, right? When I read Darcus Howe's biography and about the Black People's Day of Action, people went on strike that day. And in the US, there's a big history of people striking, not just for workers' rights, but in solidarity with other political demands as well, including police violence. But we can't really strike anymore, can we, in this country? I'm not really sure how much capacity Black British people ever had in terms of their striking, their power to strike. But more than ever, perhaps, it's so difficult to strike, right? So there's union membership is negligible these days, right? Work is very atomized, right? So you're not working on a big production line in a factory. You're probably serving coffee or working at a call centre. Work is very precarious. People on temporary contracts. There's no job for life anymore. It's very, very difficult to strike, as well as all the kind of bureaucratic barriers. You have to have this many ballots. So I don't understand it. which is what a bureaucratic barrier is for. So it's very, very difficult to strike. And so I started to think about strikes and why they were important, right? And so strikes are important because we live in a capitalist democracy, and capital and the state have a very close relationship. So if you want to put pressure on the state, it makes sense to put pressure on capital. And so therefore, if you basically hit capital in its pocket, if you disrupt production, then you're making demands on capital, right? That makes sense. It's what we might call disruption at the point of production. Things are being produced, capital needs to make a profit, we're going to stop you producing stuff, you're going to stop making money, so you listen to what we want to do. Pretty straightforward political action. Very, very difficult to do these days. But we can still disrupt capital. We still can disrupt capital flows in this country. Because although a lot of labour a lot of these kind of factory jobs might have been moved to the global south now, we're the ones still buying the stuff, right? So the interest of capital still needs Britain because of our markets, because of our buying. Cool, I'll try and be quick. And therefore, if you want to disrupt flows of capital, rather than doing it at the point of production, we can do it at the point of consumption. I felt like shutting down Westfield is almost the modern day version of a strike. You're rather than preventing capital from producing goods it needs to make a profit, you're preventing them from selling it to make a profit. And I think this has the potential to be a hugely influential and effective form of political action if it's done well, if it's done carefully, and if it's done on a mass basis. Very quickly, last 2 minutes. It gets even more bold. So I then began to think about, particularly after Joshua's talk today and what Kai David was saying, about how this reaches beyond just Britain and the US, right? So these are solidarity actions with the US and what have you. So if all of these factories, all of this production has moved to the global south through neoliberalisation and all that, during the rise of Thatcher, closing of the mines and the factories and all that, and if we already know, as has been said a number of times today, that the resources that we purchase, that are produced, come from the global south as well, then surely one of the best ways in which we can articulate and be actively in solidarity with the struggles of the people of the global south is by preventing capital from selling all of the stuff that it produces in the global south. Stop it from making a profit, right? And if we can't strike in solidarity in the same way as we perhaps used to be able to, what we can at least do is disrupt the flows of capital at the point of consumption. So that if workers or other people are striking in parts of the global south in relation to a specific industry, there is the potential there to be like, right, you guys want to strike. We can't strike in solidarity with you, but we can shut down spaces of commercial, we can shut down shopping centres, basically, stop these things from being sold, so that we can shut down the supply chain at multiple junctures. And so I feel like the potential of these kind of relatively new forms of political action that we're seeing in relation to Black Lives Matter, shutting down these big commercial shopping districts, have a greater potential than simply showing solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement or drawing greater attention to injustices of police violence here in the United Kingdom. They have the potential for us to rethink global supply chains and how we show solidarity with the peoples of the global south in a way that is comparable to the power of the strike in the generation before. Thank you.
Very good at this. Right, we have our last panelist today. I would like to welcome up Imani Robinson, who will be speaking on In a World Where Black Lives Matter, I Imagine, ... Movement building, creativity, and the rehumanization of Black lives.
Okay, I'm going to start with a little video. And at the end of it, there's a quote. And Black Lives Matter protests often end with this quote, or begin with this quote, or take up space with this quote. So I want you guys to repeat after the woman in the video, Natalie, the founder and director of Matters of the Earth, which is the organisation that I work for, and you'll know when you need to get involved. So.
Are our lives connected? Are our experiences experienced by others on the other side of the globe? Is it possible for us to be stronger in our local efforts when we connect and are part of a global movement? Black Lives Matter is more than a moment, it is a movement. It is a movement that is transcending boundaries and connecting people internationally, not only through our struggles, but also through our Black pride, strength, creativity and love. Black Lives Matter's co-founders, Patrice Cullors, Elisa Garza and Opal Tometi, are encouraging us to look for new ways to mobilise and connect and that make demands on the lives that we are entitled to. When justice is not served, families and friends need to reach out and find support in other people who have had similar experiences. These struggles are struggles that are felt all over the world by Black and brown people. The United Friends and Family campaign, the Defend the Right to Protest, and the NUS Black Student campaign are just a few of the organisations in the UK who are mobilising directly with Black Lives Matter in the US to hold state and institutions accountable for the loss of life and the brutality experienced by Black people. They are working to create support networks for those families who are facing injustice at the hands of the state. Together, they are stronger. They are learning, they are thriving, and they are sharing their experiences and their networks in order to have an international impact. The demanding of national accountability through international solidarity is only one of the beautiful ways that we can connect ourselves through the Black Lives Matter movement. In a time when we have to speak out so publicly about the brutality that we face, we also must look internally at ourselves and the way that we communicate and speak to each other. We need to make sure of the language that we're using is inclusive and is loving and is supportive and one of solidarity that does not exclude one another. My brother Luke Alexander Lloyd died recently as a result of his mental health issues and also the cuts that were brought in by the Conservative government to his mental health benefits. As an activist, I've been propelled onto the front line to fight for justice in Luke's name. We need to use the Black Lives Matter movement as a platform for sharing our stories and breaking stigmas that are associated with Black mental health within our own community and also with the primary care providers. We need to break stereotypes and the prejudice that makes somebody who is dealing with somebody with mental health issues see us as a threat or a danger. One of the beautiful things about a movement is solidarity. So we must create supportive networks where people can step into any room, any space, and feel that they're not persecuted within our own community first. I want to close by saying the Assata Shakur chant, words that fill every space where the Black Lives Matter movement occupy. I would like you, no matter where you are in the world, to repeat each sentence after me. It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and support each other.
We must love and support each other.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Thank you.
Okay. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. and it is our duty to win. At a time when Black Lives Matter is a radical political statement, what does it mean to align with this movement, to fight for freedom, to fight for Black liberation? What does it mean to win? We are in a state of war. The trauma of racism, the destructiveness of capitalism, the straitjacket of heteronormativity, the limitations laid down by the gender binary, the politics of power and of oppression, the systematic privileging of those deemed able, both physically and or mentally, to live. All of these are factors that are state-sanctioned violence and brutality. They work against our collective liberation of Black and brown people all around the world. It is our duty as movement builders and organisers to support and show solidarity to all who are fighting for freedom, to aid in the transformation and revolution of this generation. It is our duty to liberate our minds and expand the possibilities of dreaming and of achieving. Young Black and brown people should not be the first young Black or brown person of anything in 2015, but we are still presented with pioneer statistics. And whilst we are immensely proud of these achievements and these strides in Black achievement, these statistics obscure and obfuscate the successes that we gain every day and the strides we have been making for generations in all spheres of society. When we are seen as expectations to the rules and not viewed as the norm, these statistics override the fact that we are not proportionally represented in the formal spheres. We do not gain equal pay. Our livelihoods are not equal. We do not proportionally hold positions of power. Imagination, that capacity that permits fiction, play, dreaming, pure fascination, a lightness, creativity, pure joy, excitement, humanity, life coursing through ourselves, the kind of revolution you can taste. Dance, flight, movement through the space and the time of our minds. Imagination is freedom. Imagination is power. Imagination is liberation. Imagination allows us to create outside of the parameters in which we have been taught and confined. We must imagine in order to build and rise. We must dream in order to live and breathe. We must fight in order to transform and transcend. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Therefore, we must continue to imagine and to invent our own tools, to rebuild our realities, to rebuild our houses. The dreams and the requirements needed to liberate all Black people must be centred in our fight for freedom, and unapologetically so. To love and desire freedom and justice for ourselves is a necessary prerequisite for wanting the same for others. In a reality where anti-Black violence punctuates the daily experiences of Black people, it permeates our bodies and our lungs, it permeates our minds, it characterises our fear, our anger, our sorrow, at times even smothering our joy, our laughter and our love. When anti-Blackness disenfranchises us, chokes us and incites fear in us and fear of us, murders and incarcerates us, when it denies us our humanity and our right to live and to express ourselves freely and genuinely, to reimagine ourselves and our Blackness, the very logical conclusion and an essential strategy for an intersectional liberation is to ground ourselves firmly and uncompromisingly in our own truths, to be ourselves and fundamentally so, to be unapologetically human, to be unapologetically Black. This is one of the guiding principles of Black Lives Matter. We must love and support each other. At the beginning of this presentation, you watched the founder and director of Matters of the Earth speaking at the Women's Freedom Conference, which was live streamed from New York just on October 25th. Matters of the Earth are bridging the gap between the academic and the creative worlds through unarchiving, reimagining, and visualizing knowledge for engagement and mobilization. We creatively collaborate with activists, communities, and organizations, placing tools into hands in order to help people educate and empower themselves through self-organizing and the strengthening and building of movements. Natalie would be here, but she's currently building sustainable partnerships with social justice and movement building organizations in the US in order to strengthen the work that we are doing here in the UK, to share strategy and to share skills, to create international organizational structures, tap into the heritage of movement building in the African American community, which is strong, and forge networks and friendships that will make the work on the front line that we do stronger and safer. Creative collaboration in movement building for us does not necessarily mean being artistic, though our work with artists is crucial to engagement with our message. When we talk about creativity, we are explicitly speaking to the often undocumented resourcefulness and resilience of Black people in our everyday lives. Building or organizing creatively in this sense can be as revolutionary as having a liberated conversation at work or on social media about Black literature, about Black film, about valuing the voices of all Black people, including Black trans people, including Black women, including the variety of categories that we place ourselves in to deny the fact that we are human in the first place. These things are as much of a transformational strategy as holding an event as such as this one today, or as scaling a pole to tear down a Confederate flag, or the British flag, or as storming the preview of the latest cinematic silencing of the contributions, lived realities, and leadership of those whose existence has been denied repeatedly and throughout history. The daily practice of Black lives, the daily practice of Black creative resilience must continue to be named, valued, and strengthened within the movement for Black lives. We must be committed to embodying and practicing justice, liberation, and peace in our engagements with one another. This is one of the core principles of Matters of the Earth in all of our work. As an organization, we believe it is crucial to align ourselves with others in the movement, and this is a key approach we take to organizing, whether with individuals, grassroots organizations, or large-scale institutions. All have unique contributions to and impacts on the movement and are valued by us as an organization in equal measures. We believe that affiliations with others are vital because we need to be held accountable for our actions and organizing. We want a feedback loop that ensures that our truths are not silencing the truths of our fellow freedom fighters. We need to fight collaboratively because this movement is not about one group or one leader or one organization. We must not let our individual power and agency become ego. We must find strategies for self-empowerment whilst never forgetting and devaluing the importance of our collective power. Nobody gets thrown under the bus. We need to create structures that train and develop leaders in all of us. Patrisse Cullors recently defined an organizer as the smallest unit that you build your team around, the person that gets the press together, the person who helps build and launch campaigns, the person who decides what the targets will be and how we are going to change this world. Organizers then carry a lot of responsibility, both for themselves and for the movement. The constant devaluing, disregard, and murder of Black people is a global human rights issue. In the face of this, the Black Lives Matter Network is an organizing project, a movement that will succeed because of the work of its many organizations in its many contexts. It will be because of our collective knowledge, our collective power, and our collective leadership that creativity, resilience, and movement building skills in each one of us, that our collective dreams of a free and just Afro future will become manifest in our lived realities. We have nothing to lose but our chains. By becoming an active participant in the movement for Black lives, we have everything to gain. We have nothing to lose but our chains. In a world where Black lives matter, we are free to dream and to imagine ourselves in any way that we desire. to love without boundaries. Black life in all its multitude of expressions, identities, and lived realities matters on an institutional and systematic level. We are meaningfully valued in the world as human beings, as expressions of life's longing for itself. Black people love and care for themselves. We love freely, and we breathe. We have safe homes. We are living in a world that is ever blossoming. We are connected to each other and to all forms of life. The earth is valued. Nature is valued. The 7 generations principles are valued. When we organize together, we can create imaginatively. We can take action innovatively, powerfully, so that you might feel it deep within your core, coursing through your veins, through yourself, the kind of revolution you can taste. Dance, flight, movement through the space and the time of our minds, togetherness. Imagination is freedom. Imagination is power. Imagination is liberation. Black love, Black power. Be transformed by the renewal of your mind, because your life has intrinsic value. There is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. Black lives matter.
Right, so if I could ask all of our panelists to come up to the microphones, please. And the magic people have the mics. So please come up. We'll collate some of your questions and try to see if we can weave a bit of a conversation together. Just give you 1 second to get your bearings and let those who might need a bit of refreshing to go refresh themselves.
What's this going to be? And it was literally like slide, and fuck all the political parties, by the way.
Yep.
Yeah,
All right, I think we're going to go ahead and start our first set of questions here. If I could just calm the room and my panelists. You with us? Okay. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for your papers. You mentioned Herbert Harrison. We've heard Malcolm X, Panthers, Deacons of Defense, Robert F. Williams. So my question is, today in 2015, how do we position self-defense?
To the panel, thanks for your speeches, presentations. My question is, with the Black Lives Matter movement and unity, you know, the whole world, as you know, is learned behavior, you know. So what are your takes on having black media, black schools, education? Because, you know, white supremacy is one movement, you know, globally. So Black Lives Matter has got to be one movement, regardless of, you know, whether you are LGBT or, you know, whatever religion, etc. We need that unity on a global scale to be a system what is, you know, systematically looking for holes to divide and conquer black people, and it's been doing this for a long time. So, you know, what's your take on that?
Okay. And then one more from over on the side, please.
This is a question we've had tweeted in by someone from the Department of Religion and Africana Studies at Lehigh University. And they have asked, what is radical about the appeals to authenticity at the conference? It sounds like old ideas to me.
Okay, panelists. Who wants to tackle which one? We've got self-defense, positioning of Black Lives Matter in relationship to community voice and education, authenticity.
I'll start with the self-defense question, because I think one of the things that I've learned quite recently from a book. I think it's called Negroes and Guns or something. Negroes and the Gun by Nicholas Johnson. It's a history of what he calls the Black tradition of arms, which I thought initially was only kind of a side issue in terms of certain people, Robert Williams or the Panthers. But what I found in reading that book was that armed self-defense is quite at the center, at the heart of the Black freedom struggle in the United States, at least. And this is a book about, the U.S. context. So you have, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and like that generation. Obviously, they supported a civil war to abolish slavery. But even post Civil War, you have people like Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching campaigner. She has this quote where she says, a Winchester rifle should have pride of place on every mantle in Black households. There were folks like Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, many quotes of him supporting armed self-defense in the face of lynching or in the face of white mob attacks. People like even Fannie Lou Hamer, who was at the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, has this funny quote where she says, they were asking her, how do you deal with all this white terrorism? And she says, well, I have a shotgun in every corner of my room, and if any white boy steps on my lawn, he's not going to be riding mama home again. So it's actually, this is an issue that transcends political divisions. There's different, Du Bois to even Booker T. Washington had a shotgun. It transcends gender divisions. Folks like Harriet Tubman carried a gun. And I mentioned, Ida B. Wells and Fannie Lou Hamer. It transcends all these divisions, and actually all the most prominent leaders that you look at were quite supportive of armed self-defense. And so I think it's an issue that there's a rich tradition of, and something that is already in some ways percolating into the fore in terms of the movement for Black Lives. But again, it's quite taboo, and it's quite... we're right now in the process of rewriting the history of the 1960s so as to include the Deacons for Defense and to include, there's a bunch of books that have come out just in the last 2 or 3 years that actually are restoring that component of the history. So I think it will reemerge and needs to reemerge in some sense, because if the government can't protect your life, then who else but yourself can protect your life? And every organism that I can think of protects itself by any means necessary as a matter of basic survival. So,
could I just have the other panelists maybe weigh on the other two questions?
If I can just perhaps build a little bit on what Brian was saying, I think I can think of 4 ways practically that people are organising defence against police violence today in Britain in 2015. I guess one of the most straightforward ones is organisations like the Monitoring Group who are represented here today, and other organisations which take on people's cases. So when they've been brutalised by the police, they take on their cases, whether it's running media campaigns, whether it's running community campaigns, whether it's running legal campaigns, all of the kind of advocacy that's necessary for taking a case against the police. And whether that simply be to try to get them disciplined, or using different forms of kind of bureaucratic weapons to try to basically clog up the system and using that as a weapon against the police. Another one is community monitoring. We run lots of workshops with young people relating to stop and search, what to do if you're being stopped and searched, how to resist in as safe a way as possible these kinds of daily forms of aggression that a lot of our young people face on a regular basis. Popular protest is obviously another one that I guess I've kind of already mentioned. This is, I think, a good way of self-defense, in that if the police are very brutal towards someone, that they know that it's likely there'll be big protest actions in response. And urban unrest. If you look at the patterns of deaths in police custody, you can see that deaths in police custody go down after massive spates of urban unrest. I'm not necessarily saying that it's 100%, it's fantastic, when we burn cities down, but you can see that if the police feel like Britain will burn if they kill more people, then they're less likely to kill people. And I think it's important for us to recognise that and have kind of an understanding that there are many kind of consequences, a myriad of consequences to urban unrest, and one of them is the police getting in a lot of trouble with the government and others for for their actions resulting in the kind of damage that you see happening during these periods of unrest. And I think it's important for us to recognise that as well.
So, Imani, could I ask you to maybe respond to the radical question?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the things you both said, but I think also it misses out that the sort of self part. So how do I look after myself? What does self-defense mean for me today? It means self-care. And what does self-care mean? It means looking after myself in all of the ways that I will need. So I need to have a safe place to live, and I need to have people around me, and I need to be able to eat a healthy meal. And all of these things are part of a wider societal framework or network, I guess. And in order to look after myself, self-defense more than just in combat in that one moment, but self-defense on a long-term scale, for good, in sort of thinking about new paradigms of self-defense, is really about organizing and rallying around collective power so that those things are, weaved into the fabric of our society. Because without self-care, you can't really, there is no self-defense without that. So.
Thank you for that. If we can move to you can clap, it's okay. So if we could take the next three, and I think that's unfortunately going to probably be all the time we have, and then let our panelists respond to that before we move to the next part of our day. Go ahead. Oh, look, there's another person. I see you.
Right.
Very briefly.
I guess through all of the talks, what's come across to me is basically that we need to kind of get rid of capitalism. And I know the first speaker was saying, people need to go more to the left. And how do you do that? I guess it's how do you get people to vote for those? Like in England, the Green Party, for instance, like people would never go Green because they think that all their ideas are a bit too fluffy. But really, they're the only sort of party that care about actually just, was all living well, basically. So how do you kind of make that happen, I guess?
Thank you.
I'm an African. I was born in South Africa during the apartheid era. Black Lives Matters. What do you make about referring to the opposition parties within South Africa as the organizations to be recognized? Does it not mean that maybe your vision will be biased in terms of not you fulfilling your role in terms of empowering those who are in power because they're also as black as you are? I'm sorry, don't take my question as offensive. Thank you.
This question is for Mr. Kwoba, and it's in the context of the United States. The United States have claimed, and some academics claim, that the U.S. have never been a colonial country, has never wanted to have supposedly colonies. Could you mention, in that context, whether if there are colonies or have been colonies, whether colonial people directly under the colonial power that the U.S. have fought against the U.S. military, and how can you relate to that with, other people of color, African Americans, and so on?
Okay. You have to be extremely fast because I saw you.
Very simple question. How do I, as a university student, take my grassroots activism out of the academy and into the community? Because it's very hard without that power and platform to do that.
I will just say that there is a workshop tomorrow that will cover quite a bit of that movement forward. So you may be able to get quite a bit of that covered at tomorrow's workshop, and the details you can find in your program handbook. So if we can move to the panel now to then try to take us through fairly quickly through some of this, and you can defer and encourage people to speak to you later.
First question about the Green Party. I don't really have that much faith in party politics. If we look at the Green parties across the European Union, they have a far better left tradition than the Green Party in this country. And since they've all got into power, they've all sold out to neoliberalism. So I'm sorry, I don't really have any faith in the Green Party of this country not selling out to neoliberalism. Cool. Oh, he'll be next. Don't worry. Okay, so the thing about Black Lives and being in South Africa where Black people are in power, but there's still obviously enormous issues there. I think the key thing to remember is that you don't need white people to have white supremacy. Like if you live on the Niger Delta in Nigeria, you're being killed for white supremacy, for shell oil, but you're not being killed by white people, but you're still being killed by white supremacy. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we're talking about white supremacy, not white people. Oh, that was it, I think. I guess, the last thing is, I don't know whereabouts you live, but if you live in an urban area, I'm sure there are community organisations that you can join and contribute to. I don't know. You live in Newcastle? I don't know anything about Newcastle, but I'm sorry. Oh, there's some.
I will just to keep the, because everyone can hear. If you're making link after, please, and continue the love. If we could keep going with our panelist response.
If the question was how to end capitalism, and if the proposed answer was about state or party politics, there is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. This is kind of, it's speaking to the difference between liberal and radical. So choosing which party to vote for, or trying to find something that will say that it will change, but stay within mainly very similar frameworks, is pretty liberal. It's pretty surface. Things like that, we've seemed to have made liberal gains that actually haven't made any radical revolutionary change. And so our frameworks for ending capitalism or revolution need to be radical. We need to think, use our imaginations to build new houses rather than to use them as tools.
Brian?
Yeah, these are huge questions, so I'd be happy to talk more, after the panel. But just briefly, I guess, I think that the U.S., like the Democratic Party, is like the Achilles heel of the left in the U.S. It's the thing that constantly we get stuck on and we can't move beyond. So I think building some kind of independent force, whether it's the Green Party, the Green Party is not necessarily actually the best vehicle for that, but there has to be something else that we build. And that's why I looked at South Africa, because they just 2 years ago founded a new party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, which, as I said, it got over 1 million votes. They have parliamentarians now. They're growing rapidly. And it's an openly socialist party under a government, to speak to the other question, which has massacred striking black mine workers. And so I think when you're in that situation, we have to recognize that colonialism comes in two phases, right? There's the colonial and the neo-colonial. So South Africa dealt with the colonial phase in some sense by getting rid of white rule. Now they have black rule, which is like a neo-colonial regime. It's a regime that is acting in the interests of white monopoly capital, with black police officers, black government that murders workers on strike. So we have to, I think, continue that understanding of the need to really have that radical change. And the last thing I'll just say about this is I think that we need a very serious confrontation of and critique of the white left, because historically, Marxism has been a great framework for thinking about capitalism and revolutionary change, the power of the working class and so on. But it's been this kind of defensively guarded private property of white folks. And so, how do we disrupt that and bring the good, the class politics and that sort of thing from Marxism, but not in a way that reproduces white supremacy and white leftist, white male left kind of politics. And so I think that's the challenge. And there's a number of thinkers, people like Selma James or even CLR James, folks who have begun to do that. But we have to find our own way. And I think it's going to be something new. It's going to be something like in the EFF in South Africa, they talk about Marxist-Leninist Fanonian politics, which is like, oh, okay, that's interesting, because they're actually trying to begin to synthesize different strands of radical black and class struggle type Pan-Africanist traditions. So let's talk more after the panel, but these are some of the things that come to mind.
I will just let you know, anyone who's taught 17th, 18th, or 19th century history of the Americas would never say that the U.S. is not a colonial country, from indigenous peoples to other folks. And I'm sorry, we're going to have to call it a day, but please do come in and talk to the panelists about that particular question. But I will have to turn it over to the next segment of the program. But please thank our speakers for their contributions.